Okay, the clock has started, which means we have less than 45 minutes to get through our material. Well, thanks everybody for having us here today. We're here, I think on your programs, it says that it's foreign policy, Russia, Ukraine, and then we are announced as a panel that's here to talk about supporting Ukraine. So those with eagle ears will see that there's a little bit of a difference in that. I want to start off by thanking the CSFN for having us here today, especially Adam Bolek and his team of volunteers and staff for putting this together. Also want to thank all the sponsors. These sorts of conferences, it's not always easy to get sponsorship. So I want to thank all the sponsors, so thank you. My name's Larissa Waller, and I am the moderator for today's discussion. I'm a Canadian of Ukrainian heritage. I am based in Toronto. My children attend a Ukrainian day school. We live the war in Ukraine every single day. When Russia first escalated their invasion of Ukraine, we were doom scrolling, looking at pictures, looking for people we knew. And then when October 7th happened to Israel, it felt like that's happening again to a community that I care very much about. So I wear this friendship pin. It's the Ukrainian flag with the Israeli flag. It's not just because I love Israelis. It's because what's happening in Ukraine is happening in Israel. And I want to start a discussion with anybody who wants to talk about it of why those two things are linked. And I think today we'll get into that. So I want to welcome my panel. Dr. Balkan-Devlin, Mark Spiro, Matt Bondi, I'll let you guys introduce yourselves.
All right. Thank you very much, Larissa, and thank you for the organizers for this opportunity. It has been a fascinating 2.5 days, and I'm looking forward for the rest of the conference as well, and to be part of the family here, so it's nice. My name is Balkan-Devlin. I'm a senior fellow and the director of the Transatlantic Program at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Larissa, and thank you, Adam Bolek and the CSFN team for pulling together not only this conference, but this panel today. My name is Mark Spiro. I work at Crestview Strategy.
I just echo the comments, thanking those who are involved in organizing. What a fantastic job on a huge, complex event. My name is Matthew Bondi. I have the privilege of working in public affairs with a focus on defense and security issues. I joined Balkan as a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and just because it's relevant to Larissa's comments, I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to serve as the only non-Jewish member of the Consulate Advisory Board for the Consul General of Israel in Toronto.
Cool. So we have a few sort of areas of discussion we're going to get through today. The first one, I'm going to base off some comments that former Prime Minister Bennett talked about in his speech earlier. It's the idea of good versus evil. And there's good guys and there's bad guys in this world. And in the question of Ukraine, in my opinion, and I would imagine that my panelists share this opinion, we're the good guys, and Russia's the bad guys. And there's a new axis of evil sort of emerging on a world stage. And I was hoping, Dr. Devlin, if you want to get into that a little bit, and Mark and Matt will join in as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are two ways to think about this. We have been talking just before the panel started. There are shades of gray in international politics. There are things that you need to be, creating a modus vivendi, engaging in the nuances and the context. But then there are, circumstances and events that the line is very clear. Right? There is gray, there is negotiation, there is compromise on trade, or what this regulation would look like, or whether the institutional structure will be as such, and so on and so forth. But there is not much of a shades of gray when one aggressor invades another sovereign country, kills, kidnaps, rapes, pillages across and burns down as they progress. And the people of that country are fighting back and fighting for their lives and their home and their families and their heart. In the case of Russia's invasion in Ukraine, and as the Prime Minister said before, when it comes to Israel and Gaza, the lines are very bright red and clear. Right? There is, people don't like to talk about us versus them in general, but there are cases in which it is us versus them. There is a clear line where you need to stand and what you need to do in order to defend what your principles are, what is the good thing to do, what is the right thing to do, what is a smart thing to do. And yes, there is evil in the world. There is bad actors in the world. Not everything is misunderstanding. Not everything is misaligned incentives. Not everything is if we just get together in a room and talk and we can sort this out. How would you be able to do that when they kidnapped hundreds of thousands of your children and take them to indoctrinate them? How would you be able to do that when they line up your civilians and shot them in the head after tying them up? How would you be able to do that when they rape from 7 to 7-year-old, right? So there is a very clear line in certain circumstances. And Russia's war in Ukraine is definitely one of them. And I will stop here after one more comment, because I tend to talk a lot. This is my bread and butter, we talk. The line here, I think, the important thing to remember is that you may want to consider the context and look at the shades of gray. Our adversaries, our enemies, are not. They see the West, and Ukraine is part of the West, as enemy, as groups that will be subjugated and controlled and defeated. This is true for Russia. This is true for Communist China. This is true for the death cult that runs Iran. This is true for Hamas and others, et cetera, et cetera. So we have to be clear-eyed of what the lines are, how they see us, and what they plan to do.
Mark, you want to jump in?
Well, look, I think the first thing is we have to start with a conversation of, is there such a thing as evil? And certainly I have a point of view on this, but we have been socializing ourselves now for ostensibly my entire lifetime to talk about the world in shades of gray. And to say, well, I don't know, is there something truly that is evil? And I think the first thing that we have to do when we're being realistic about any foreign policy is be declarative and say, evil exists. It is a real thing. It is not a fallacy. Evil is real. And we, by the way, look in the mirror. We're not evil. We're not the evil side. There are black hats and there are white hats, and in this fight, we are the ones wearing the white hats. There is no ambiguity here. There should be no hesitancy to call out our enemies, and I use the word enemies quite deliberately, as enemies and as evil. Anyone who perpetuates some of the things that Balkan just ran through, and frankly, I don't want to even run through the litany of the crimes that are perpetrated on behalf of our enemies to prosecute their agenda. I don't want to talk about them. I don't want to think about them ever. It's important that we know they happened. It's important that we acknowledge them, but I don't want to give these people the credit or memorializing them for the atrocities that they commit. But if there is anything at all that we need to do, hopefully with a change of government, which is coming hopefully sooner than 18 months, but let's say at the worst 18 months, if there's one thing that we need to do, we need to get back on the side of being declarative about good and evil, calling out our enemies for being who they are, which are our enemies, and then ultimately prosecuting a case against them, not only abroad, but also domestically in our own country, where there's some question and some deliberation as to, again, whether good or evil exists, and whether or not even we are the side of good. You know, James Burnham, Suicide of the West. Read the book. That's the place we find ourselves in today.
Matt?
Well, I mean, I agree with these guys. Can I just... I think on the question of good and evil, I do find it interesting. As a person of faith, within my faith tradition, I certainly feel that evil exists, and you have to, unfortunately, in this dangerous world, good has to be better armed and organized than evil. And that's something we're failing at pretty preposterously right now, and it's a real concern. I think just one little note that I would add after what we just heard from our colleagues is there's a battle of good and evil, which can take many forms. There's also a battle between systems, right? And so if you take it into more of a temporal kind of category, there's a competition between systems, and liberal democracy is not winning right now.
No, yeah.
Let's be really clear. This is what losing looks like. We're losing. We don't have to. We have a stronger industrial base, and it can be even stronger. We can refine our character as being proud liberal Democrats, regardless of marginal tinkering between political parties. And we can stop this process of kind of self-contempt for the values that have built Western civilization. And I think just on the concept of a battle between systems, there's liberal democracy and then there's wrong. And that's it. There's no other options. There's no managed democracy in Russia that Putin tried. I think we all probably remember that, right? There's no communist kind of democracy in China. There's liberal democracy and there's wrong. And we have to be full-throated, kind, compassionate, wise, and clear that it's liberal democracy or wrong, and we want to help promote liberal democracy around the world.
Yeah, I'll say, yes, great. I'll say this on emerging democracies, because one of the criticisms I hear about Ukraine all the time is that, oh, it's corrupt just like Russia. It's not. No. It's not corrupt just like Russia. No. Ukraine's a newer democracy. Ukraine's still learning. Ukraine's still fighting. It's not a perfect democracy, but it is absolutely a Western democracy by any standard. And we have to have that grace for countries that are newer, that are striving to achieve what we have here. So that's just one quick call out I wanted to make there. Next sort of topic we're going to talk about, and this is one where I've struggled as a partisan conservative. A lot of members of the Conservative Party don't support Ukraine. We hear that, I hear that at conferences like this. I heard that at our party convention last September. And it's really made me think about why that is. And I can understand when gas costs $1.60 a liter, why it's hard to wrap your head around sending billions of dollars overseas. I can understand that. I've done some self-reflection on this and thought, when the Liberal Party announces anything, my first reaction is to poke holes at it. How am I going to oppose it? And I think that in the case of Ukraine, the truth is when the prime minister of the day is the prime minister of the day during wartime, the war becomes his issue, win or lose. By and large, actually not by and large, on some measure, Justin Trudeau has been okay on Ukraine. And so it's become his winning issue. And I think a lot of partisan conservatives have sort of taken that to mean that they have to oppose it. It was actually true when Prime Minister Stephen Harper was Prime Minister and Russia first invaded Ukraine. He was the guy who had Ukraine as the winning issue. He did a lot of good things for Ukraine. It was his win domestically. And I think that's what's happened with Prime Minister Trudeau. I think you've got Prime Minister Trudeau sort of owning this issue, so we want to oppose it. And you have a guy like Tucker Carlson who opposes it, so we want to oppose it even more. I'm going to very delicately ask Mark Spiro what he thinks about this.
Buckle up.
Yeah.
I was going to bring a water gun, but I won't. So I'm going to ask Spiro to take this one on.
Yeah, thanks. I'll be as judicious as I can be on this point.
I don't. I'm not going to hold you back.
How about that? Look, I begin with this. We're all used to a 12-hour clock. We know what a 12-hour clock looks like. I know some of you, if you're young, they don't teach how to tell time in school anymore, but they're not on your, it's not this digital thing. It's this thing. It's got numbers on it. Anyway, you should probably learn about it. They don't teach children how to tell time anymore. It's really, I'm not kidding. I wish I were making that up.
We give you a microphone, and we just... Sit back.
I wish I were making that up. So think of a 24-hour clock when there are 24 numbers on the dial. And Justin Trudeau is that proverbial broken clock who's been right once a day. And since 2015, I can count the number of issues that I've agreed with Justin Trudeau on. Well, not even on one hand. I can count it on one finger. But the one finger, which isn't the middle one, by the way, is Justin Trudeau has been right in theory on Ukraine. I'd argue that he hasn't been right enough, to be perfectly frank. I think we'll talk a little bit more about what an alternative view of Ukraine is, or policy on Ukraine is shortly. It may not look like it because I'm, very young looking, but, as a child of the 1980s, I grew up in a time when conservatism was broadly made up of three planks, or seen as a tripod of foreign policy realists. Some now pejoratively use the word neoconservative. I wouldn't use it pejoratively. People who are in favor of lower taxes and regulation cuts, and also used equally pejoratively the concept of a social conservative. As someone who considers themselves an unhyphenated conservative who would check all three of those boxes. But if I had to pick the one that I leaned into most, it would be the foreign policy stuff. That is the thing that attracted me to conservative politics in the first place. Growing up in the 1980s, I was ashamed of Prime Minister Trudeau, not the current one, but the former one, and his behavior, especially towards our allies south of the border. In the middle of the greatest fight of our lifetime, Canada was, this may ring a bell, not a reliable ally to our friends, and instead complicit often with our enemies, much like today. For conservatives who fail to understand that in my view certainly, that the biggest fight is the fight for freedom, liberal democracy, and Western civilization, honest to God, you're missing the plot, right? This to me, sure, am I in favor of lower taxes? Absolutely. And getting rid of regulation? Absolutely. I'm a pro-lifer, and I'm very proud of that as well. But there is nothing more important than freedom and liberty. Because without those, we don't have the others. And our enemies, again, our enemies are not for freedom, they are not for liberty, and they are not for Western civilization. And the folks in Ukraine right now are fighting our fight on behalf of those three things, and we should recognize that, acknowledge that, and support that as much as we possibly can.
Matt.
So I'm just kind of getting to know Mark here, and I didn't know we had so much in common. But I think Mark said something really relevant to the conference that Mr. Bolek and others have put on that we're all enjoying today and this week. It's about the integrity of the conservative movement, and I think that's really on point. Mark's referring, as he knows, to this concept of conservative fusionism that William F. Buckley and others helped put together after we won the Second World War and had to dig in for a long, cold war against communism. And the integrity of the conservative movement really does require a sustained commitment to those three stools. And something that I see, and Larissa mentioned that there's actually a creeping sense of lack of support for Ukraine amongst the conservative movement. Let's just talk about that openly for a sec. That's MAGA stuff, right? And it's MAGA stuff, and it's getting into Canada, and it's this idea of isolationism and being able to wish away the problems of the world. But the world's getting smaller, not bigger. The authoritarians and the communists are on the march, and we are losing the preponderance of power that has kept us and our parents' generation safe. And we are in the process right now, unless we start doing better, of handing a weaker West and more dangerous world to our children. And that's not okay.
Yeah, and you know what, I was going to ask you this. Talk to us about, going back to the first question, what if the bad guys win? What does the new world order win? What does it mean for Russia and China and Iran to win? What does it mean for us here?
Yeah, before just jumping on that, let me just add two points to why conservatives need to be the one that is leading and forward-leaning when it comes to Ukraine. I mean, the conference's subtitle here is leading with conviction, right? It's not about making empty promises or virtue signaling or searching for compromise. That's the other guys that does that. And promising things and not delivering. Trudeau is saying the right things. Only 44% of what has been promised was delivered. Our allies come back again and again and ask for Canadian energy, Canadian LNG. We keep sending them back. How Vladimir Putin finances its war is through its energy. And we are not cutting that off. We are not helping our allies and others in the world to wean themselves off from the Russian energy, right? So we are not doing what we can. And it was, as you pointed out, it was under Harper that Operation Unifier started, right? It was Harper who looked at Vladimir Putin in 2014 and said, get the hell out of Ukraine, right? It is an issue that conservatives need to own and fulfill the promises and lead with conviction rather than just make announcements instead of a policy. So I think that's the important one.
Just want to jump in on something really quick there. The connection between, and I think this is essential to sustaining a strong classic Anglo-American foreign policy in the Canadian conservative movement, tying the international agenda to the domestic agenda, especially around industrial regulation and reform. So, like Mark said, freedom is the main thing, but there's a whole opportunity within Canada's energy industry, defense industry, to revamp, lean in with our allies, invest, and to make us safer and wealthier at the same time. And there are some bits of progress going on right now. There are major proposals in front of the government of Canada to expand ammunition, specifically for howitzers. Disclosure, a client of mine, Communitech, was just designated a official NATO innovation accelerator. So there's these green shoots, but the opportunity to drive economic growth through a smart foreign policy lens is really massive, and it's right in front of us.
Yeah. And going back to this notion that there's a phrase that I keep saying whenever I have the opportunity since February 2022, and that is supporting Ukraine is not charity, but self-interest.
Yes.
This is not giving arms. This is defending Canadian interests, Canadian values, our prosperity, and our security. Now, why the world would look like, right? That is what we need to focus on. Our prosperity and security heavily relies on two things. One, that the West, as Canada being part of, remains preponderant and shapes the rules. As a trading nation, our prosperity heavily relies on knowing that we can get our goods to the markets and get things in, and that we are sitting on those tables, that the decisions are being made. If you take out the United States and the Western set order and replace it with China, with Russia, with Iran, shaping the rules of the game, not everything will remain the same. I think the fundamental thing we need to understand that if we do not want to pay the pennies today in defending this system of liberty, if we do not emphasize peace through strength, we will be paying hundreds of dollars down the future because we are not the ones that will continue to shape the rules of the game that this plays. And we have to be relying on the very fact that today the front line is in Ukraine. Today, Russia, together with China, together with Iran, together with North Korea, try to undermine this international system that we and our prosperity benefited significantly throughout decades. And at the same time, going back to the subversion component, enemies of the West within our countries are trying to undermine and weaken the system. So it's a dual assault. One, on the one hand, the authoritarian regimes, assaulting the international system outside, weakening that particular system, and on the other hand, onto Western moments within our societies, from far left woke to Islamists on the streets, try to undermine and subvert our system. And if we do not push back and lead with conviction, we'll pay the price.
I'm going to let Mark.
Well, I think this goes to your point, Larissa, but what happens as a consequence of Ukraine not being victorious? Well, my son goes to a Jewish day school in Toronto. He already has to go to school, pass through metal detectors, and have police outside his school all day long. And the police, unlike in Russia, aren't to keep the kids inside the class. They're to keep the bad guys from getting inside the class. Now, what happens if Russia is victorious in Ukraine? Well, ultimately, to me, it probably means my son is living in a gulag. So bad enough at the moment, he goes to school in a jail every day. But worse if he were living in a country that were simply an open-air prison camp, which is effectively what Russia still is. There are very strong economic arguments to me about why we need to make sure Ukraine is victorious in this war. But to me, the stronger argument is, I have two stronger arguments, for me anyway. One is the moral argument, back to good versus evil, right versus wrong, and I think the picture there is crystal clear. The second being, where do you draw the line?
Yeah.
So today it's Ukraine. Tomorrow it's Moldova. Is it Poland? Is it Finland? Is it Western Germany?
Piccadilly?
Huh?
London? Where do we start?
Is it the Canadian Arctic?
Well,
Is that where we draw the line?
Well, I mean, Putin's told us, right, on the eve of the Beijing Olympics, Putin and China stood there and told us they're looking for a new world order, and that Canadian Arctic's looking pretty good. And what does that mean for us?
Listen, when Hamas tells me they want to kill me,
You believe him?
I absolutely believe them, right? I believe them. And when Putin says he's intent on, at the very least, restoring the Russian Empire, I believe him too.
Yeah.
I believe him. And I think at our peril, many of us have ignored Hamas or Hezbollah. We've also ignored Putin and Xi and what they're saying. And it's time we start to pay attention. Someone tells you something over and over and over, take their word for it, right? Just believe them, right?
Something that I think is significant when it comes to kind of the binary way that we kind of tend to look at the world as conservatives is there is one bright spot that I can think of, which is NATO. And when you look at the situation, like the world's on fire, right? You have Hong Kong getting eaten alive by a communist regime. You have the invasion of Ukraine. You have the Jewish state being embattled in almost a second Holocaust. We do have NATO. And there is something important about recognizing that although there's all kinds of subversive activity, foreign interference, the bad guys are at war with us through non-kinetic means in NATO. But no one has attacked NATO yet. And I think it's a significant bright spot in the world today. And it shows us that alliances work when they're armed to the teeth, and everybody believes if you cross a certain line, you're going to have to find out real quick. And so the way that the Ukraine situation needs to end is within NATO as soon as possible.
Which is, if I look at my notes here, question 3 to Matt Bondi. Matt, you're a deep thinker. No, honestly, that's what the notes say. But Matt and I used to work together, and Matt was the deep thinker, and I thought about a lot of things, but about that deep. But Matt was like this deep. But Matt and I have talked about this quite a little bit. We haven't all four talked about this. I'm actually interested to see if there is some disagreement on this question. What does victory for Ukraine look like? What's good enough for you, and what do you think is good enough for Ukraine?
Yeah.
I know how Spyro feels. But honestly, what do you think victory for Ukraine looks like? And how do we get there?
Yeah. Victory for Ukraine is what victory is. It's kicking the bad guys out of your country, right? Full stop. It's not complicated. And the thing is, Ukraine has the ability to win. Just like the Jewish state of Israel will prevail against Hamas, Ukraine will win and can win. The West needs to get its pants on from the perspective of production capacity and send that stuff over. And as we wrote in an op-ed for the Toronto Star together, we need to close the skies over Ukraine.
Yep.
And we can do that. And there's, to Canada's credit, it was recently admitted by the good graces, particularly of the United Kingdom, to a new drone coalition, which is going to be very significant to supporting the Ukrainians as they, start getting into those F-16s, which takes a long time. But victory for Ukraine is what we all know victory to be. It's kicking the bad guys out. It's becoming part of NATO and never looking back.
Yeah, I mean, yes. I have a lot of conversations with journalists who constantly ask me, basically give me a Sharpie and a map and tell me to trace on a map how much of the East is the Ukrainian community in Canada willing to give up for Ukraine, and how much of Crimea is okay to give up to Russia just so that there's peace. And I often say, peace isn't peaceful. Peace comes from victory. We have to win. If we give Russia what they try to take, there's no peace. You give Russia, you get a temporary ceasefire where Russia literally will use that time to call up more cannon fodder, which is what their conscripts are. Call up more cannon fodder, rearm, get more weapons from Iran, get more weapons from China, and come back. There is no peace without victory. And that's messy, and that is sad, and war sucks. But that's where we are. We didn't start the war. We being the West, we being Israel, we being Ukraine. We didn't start this war, but we have to win.
Well said.
Yep. Defeat is a choice by us at this stage.
You're right, yeah.
Right? We can choose either to accept and make sure that Putin's bet that the West does not have the staying power and can give up. And it will not end there. As you point out, Russia is not an acute threat that would suddenly magically disappear and everything will be honky-donkey if we suddenly freeze the battle lines. Russia is a chronic threat that will be with us for the next generation. The intermission from history is over, right? It's back, and we need to be quite clear-eyed about it. And it is a choice for us. Ukrainians are fighting and dying. They're not asking us to go and fight. They're asking us, give us the shield, give us a sword, and we'll be able to fight back and push back. And we're dithering on that. We have the capacity. The Russians are, 14%, 15% of GDP in terms of war economy. They're on war footing. The Chinese are getting on war footing. They're not getting ready to deter, to prevent West from coming in. The Chinese are getting ready. The Russians are already in the offensive. We are already in war at this stage. We could give what Ukrainians need to win back, to impose a strategic defeat to Russians on the battlefield that will change the calculus in Kremlin and could lead to victory. And we could do that.
Mark?
So here's what I would say, going back to one of my favorite topics, which is conservatives who are on the wrong side of history. For those who say the reason why we have to take this position on Ukraine is because we need to create differentiation with Trudeau, I would say to them, I'm fine with creating differentiation with the current prime minister, but here's how I would do it. I would do it by going a little further than Trudeau is going, exactly. Which is we will fulfill our funding commitments and our materiel commitments immediately. We will scale up to ensure that we can do so. Our position is Ukraine admitted to NATO immediately, and we will not cease until Russian forces are out of all territory that they've seized from Ukraine, and ideally, that Putin is no longer in power in Russia. Now that creates some ability to differentiate from Justin Trudeau, because I respectfully suggest that, one, Justin Trudeau probably isn't prepared to go that far, and if he showed up at NATO at this moment to make any sort of demand or ask from our NATO allies, like Dr. Roy just did, they would laugh him out of the room.
Matt, so we have time for question 4, which is sort of related to what we just talked about. I want to talk about the specific threat for Canada. And Balkan said this, that this Ukrainian victory is not charity for Canada. We have an interest. We share a border with Russia. There's a lot we can do as Canadians to help with the Ukrainian victory, investing in our LNG resources. When Greece and Germany come here begging for LNG, we could say yes. Because if not, they're going to go to one of the bad guys and ask them, and they're happily going to say yes. When we have the ability to help them, we could do things like war risk insurance. We could do things, there's a lot we could do. Ramp up our ammunition. All of these things we could do is also good for us. But Russian defeat is also good for us. Talk about that a little.
So threat to Canada. Something that I think we really need to look in the eye is the fact that Canada is NATO's soft underbelly. And it's really a shame. And it's been chronic. It is a bipartisan failure. I think I would kind of trace back to the domestic analogy, which as we know is the idea that states almost kind of can personify personalities and they deal with one another as though people would. I think a real risk for Canada right now is with the appeasement that we see being considered by many states, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's Israel, whether it's Ukraine. Appeasement is so dangerous, but it doesn't hurt right now, right? And that's why it's so dangerous. There's going to be a massive bar bill to pay if we don't stop the authoritarians from continuing to march, like Balkan says rightly that they are. So, if we abandon Israel, if we abandon Taiwan, if we abandon Ukraine, Canada's space of security becomes smaller and smaller. And then we're kind of back, we're really only looking at NATO itself, current members, being part of what we presume is a safe community due to collective defense. But when Russia and China continue marching toward NATO members to really test their mettle, Canada's going to be a prime target, and we are just not ready.
Can I jump on that one real quick?
Yeah, and I actually want to get you to talk about, remember we talked about yesterday, the impact, our system in Canada is based on the U.S. being in charge. The prices we pay at the grocery store is because the U.S. is in charge. So if the U.S. isn't in charge, what does that mean for us?
It doesn't look good, does it? I mean,
No.
if at the very bottom, right, the North Atlantic Alliance, the Euro-Atlantic Alliance, based on the fact that North America is a sanctuary in which the West can project power abroad, right? Throughout the Cold War against the Soviet Union, the notion is that US and Canada, safe in its geographic location, can project power when Soviet Union at the time, Russia and China today, decide to march and change the order that we all benefited from. I mean, just one very simple example, the freedom of navigation, right? It's an aberration, historically speaking. That is, your ability to traverse world's oceans unhindered is not what we generally did throughout centuries. The post-Second World War order in which this was made possible is due to the American Navy, right? That system enabled prosperity and security here in Canada, right? When the authoritarians started to march in Russia, in China, and started to shrink that space, that operating space, for us, as Matt pointed out, what is the first thing that they need to do? They need to ensure that the sanctuary in North America is no longer a sanctuary, that American behemoth aided by Canada, is geared up and send help. How do you do that? You subvert the system internally, and you target the critical infrastructure from communication lines to the ports, to the electricity grid, both cyber attacks and other attacks, so that the force doesn't come out. So if you think that when Russians started to march, when the Chinese do invade Taiwan or engage action in South China Sea, that our geography will protect us, you're sorely mistaken. Right?
Matt,
So it
Matt's
cannot be
desperate
done.
to jump in here.
Yeah, no, I just want to echo this a little bit. You mentioned like the United Nations. I think something that we really need to recognize is that we talk about these systems as though they're things that run themselves. The WTO, the United Nations, NATO, but those are just like logos, right? It's countries, it's the state system. It's probably always going to be the state system. And when you talk about how life looks with the United States in charge, that's a pretty good deal. And something that we forget, and actually, I know he didn't come back for me, but Michael Ignatieff wrote a really great book called The Liberal Empire. And the fact is, we need to have the courage to recognize this and say it, we need a liberal, Anglo-American inspired U.S. empire to continue as a force for good and to advance through legal and positive economic, political engagement to advance democracy around the world. There is no international system as it exists now without the U.S. at the head of the table.
So,
Mark?
sorry, you're saying that the United Nations is probably not the vehicle to deliver on that? I mean, look, this is the fallacy of all of this stuff. When someone opens a foreign policy discussion and the first words in their mouth are the United Nations or the International Court for Criminal Justice, at best you should eye roll them. That's at best. Really, what you should do is you should confront them. We are so blessed here to have been born, frankly, in the time and the place in which we were. But the fact that we have washed our hands of our history and our legacy, and we're willing now to buy into some mythological Canada, which, by the way, has never existed except in the dream of some university professors or people named Trudeau, and say, this is what our country was about, this is how our country exists, these are our core values, this is beyond mythology. And if it were just mythology, if this were just some ridiculous nursery rhyme that it taught children in school, that would be one thing. This is serious. This is life. We are at war. Whether it's a shooting war or not, we can debate that. But we were certainly in the war of ideas and ideals. And if we don't participate and prosecute this like an actual conflict, which if we are not successful in, starting with Ukraine, we are in for an awful world of hurt and pain. All right? We have to be vigilant and treat this for the serious matter for which it is. This isn't, oh, no one in Canada ever votes on foreign policy. Who cares? This isn't about votes. This is about the continuance of our civilization and our country, for goodness sakes. We have to engage and debate on this.
Awesome. We have 51 seconds left. We talked yesterday about what would success look like for our panel and what do we want to achieve. And we figured in this room, there's more people than we thought would come, so thank you. We figured 25% of you are like rah-rah, you wear it on your sleeve. 25% of you think we're nuts, and about 50% of you probably agree, but don't really want to talk about it. So we need that 50% of you who don't really want to talk about it to talk about it, to talk about it loudly, to talk about it often, to tell people who say that it's not our job to support Ukraine, it's not in our interest to support Ukraine, tell them they're wrong. And it's going to be your friends, and it's going to be people you like and respect and people you work with. And we need you to tell them why it's important that Ukraine wins.
Hear, hear.
So thank you for your time today. And that's it.